The church smelled the way it always did on Sunday morning: cedar wood and candle wax, and the faint sweetness of coffee brewing in the parish hall. On September 14th, 1980, in the town of Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, population 4,000, the pews of St. Michael's Catholic Church filled, slowly, the way they did every week, with the same faces, the same families, the same unhurried rhythm of a community that had worshipped together for generations. At 9:15 a.m., Margaret Fontenot took her usual place at the front of the children's classroom, just off the main nave, and arranged the morning's lesson on the chalkboard. She had a way of doing it that the children loved, drawing a picture first, before the words, so they would lean forward to see what was coming. That Sunday, she drew a dove. What happened in the 90 minutes that followed would leave Breaux Bridge broken, bewildered, and searching for answers for the next 42 years. Margaret Fontenot was 34 years old in the fall of 1980. She was 5'4". With dark hair she kept pulled back during the week and let down on Sundays. And she had the kind of laugh, open and a little loud, that people remembered long after the conversation was over. She had grown up in St. Martin Parish, the second of 5 children in a family that had farmed crawfish ponds along the Tech since her grandfather's time. She had studied elementary education at the University of Southwestern Louisiana in Lafayette, and after graduating in 1968, she had returned home, taken a job at Breaux Bridge Elementary, and stayed. She was, by the time of her death, the kind of woman a town builds itself around without ever quite acknowledging it. She had been teaching Sunday school at St. Michael's for 11 years. She knew every child in that room by name, by family, by the specific way each one held a crayon or bit their lip when they were concentrating. She kept a jar of butterscotch candy on her desk, not as a reward, just because she thought children shouldn't have to earn sweetness. And she remembered every birthday. Every one. She sent a card. She was not married. She had been engaged once, in her late 20s, and the engagement had ended quietly, and the town had let it be. What she had instead was a classroom full of other people's children, whom she loved without reservation, and a garden behind her house on Atchafalaya Street, where she grew tomatoes and zinnias and mint she would cut on Friday afternoons and arrange in a glass jar on her kitchen table. She drove a 1974 Chevrolet Malibu, light blue. The back seat was always full of craft supplies for Sunday school. That morning, she had packed construction paper in 6 colors, a box of crayons, and a bag of cotton balls she planned to use for a project about clouds. She stopped at the Piggly Wiggly on Highway 31 on her way to church for a gallon of orange juice for the parish hall. The receipt was time-stamped 8:47 a.m. That was the last purchase she ever made. By 10:30 that morning, her classroom was empty, and the children had been sent, confused and frightened, back to their parents. A substitute had been found. Nobody could explain where Margaret had gone. Her car was found at 2:15 p.m. That Sunday afternoon, parked behind the feed store on Grand Point Highway, 2 miles from the church. The driver's door was unlocked. The construction paper and the crayons and the bag of cotton balls were still on the back seat. The orange juice was on the passenger floor. It had been opened. 1 glass had been poured. The rest was untouched. Deputy Clarence Thibodeau of the St. Martin Parish Sheriff's Office took the initial call. He arrived at the vehicle at 2:34 p.m. and noted in his report that there were no signs of a struggle inside or around the car, no indication of mechanical failure, and no witnesses who had seen the vehicle arrive at its location. The feed store was closed on Sundays. The lot was empty. Whoever had left the car there had done so with no one watching. By 3:00 p.m., the search had begun. By nightfall, the wooded strip along the bayou behind the feed store had been walked twice. By midnight, the parish had organized a volunteer team. By the following Tuesday, more than 200 people had turned out. Church members, former students, neighbors who had known Margaret for 30 years. Her body was found on Wednesday morning, September 17th, in a drainage ditch off Catahoula Road, less than a mile from the feed store. She had been strangled. She had not been moved far. The medical examiner established that she had been killed sometime on the afternoon of Sunday the 14th, within hours of her car being left behind the feed store. She had been 34 years old. She had a Sunday school lesson planned for the following week. The cotton balls were going to be clouds. A partial boot print was recovered from the mud at the edge of the ditch. A single fiber, dark wool, was found on her coat collar. The evidence was preserved. The parish waited. Detective Raymond Arsenault had been with the St. Martin Parish Sheriff's Office for 9 years when the Fontenot case landed on his desk. He was 41 years old, methodical in the way that men who grew up on farms tend to be, patient with process, suspicious of shortcuts, resistant to conclusions that arrived too quickly. He had worked homicides before, but nothing like this. Nothing in a town this small, nothing involving someone this known. The immediate investigation turned on 2 names. The first was a man named Gerald Broussard, a seasonal laborer from Henderson, who had been seen near the church parking lot the previous weekend and who had 2 prior arrests for harassment in Iberia Parish. He was interviewed on September 19th voluntarily and provided an alibi for Sunday afternoon. He had been at his brother's house in Breaux Bridge watching the Saints game. 4 family members confirmed it. Arsenault noted in his file that the alibi was solid and that Broussard, while worth investigating, did not fit the geography of the crime. He was eliminated by the end of September. The second name was more troubling. Dennis Mountain was 38 years old in 1980. He was a foreman at a rice processing facility outside Cecilia, married with 3 children, and a longtime parishioner at St. Michael's. His youngest 2 children had been in Margaret Fontenot's Sunday school class for the previous 2 years. He was, by every visible measure, a fixture of the community. The kind of man who organized the fish fry fundraiser and coached his son's Little League team and sat in the 4th pew from the front at 9 a.m. Mass without fail. He was also, Arsenault would later note in a memo that remained buried in the case file for 4 decades, the last person to have spoken to Margaret Fontenot before she left the church that morning. A witness, a woman named Celeste Trosclair, who had been arranging flowers in the side chapel, told investigators she had seen Dennis Mountain and Margaret speaking near the side door of the church at approximately 10:05 a.m. The conversation had seemed ordinary. Margaret had been carrying her keys. Mountain was interviewed twice in October 1980. He acknowledged speaking with Margaret that morning. He said they had discussed an upcoming fundraiser. He said he had watched her walk toward her car and had returned inside the church. He was polished in the way that frightened men sometimes are. Calm, cooperative, just the right amount of sorrow. He had an alibi of sorts. His wife said he had come home by noon, eaten lunch with the family, and watched television for the rest of the afternoon. It was not an alibi. It was a wife saying what a wife in 1980 felt she was expected to say. Arsenault noted his suspicions in writing. He requested permission to pursue Mountain more aggressively. His supervisor denied the request. The Mountain family had standing in the parish. Without physical evidence directly connecting Dennis Mountain to the crime scene, any further scrutiny risked a lawsuit and a complaint to the sheriff. The investigation continued in other directions. By the spring of 1981, every lead had been exhausted. The case went cold. Margaret Fontenot's killer was still in the fourth pew at 9 a.m. Mass. The years have a way of settling over a case the way sediment settles over a riverbed. Slowly, completely, without drama. By 1985, the Fontenot investigation had been formally downgraded to inactive status. The boot print cast sat in an evidence box in a storage room at the parish courthouse. The wool fiber was sealed in an envelope beside it. Raymond Arsenault had requested twice more, in 1982 and in 1984, that the case be reopened for further work on Dennis Mouton. Both requests were denied. In 1986, he retired from the sheriff's office. He did not let it go. He kept a copy of his case notes at home, in a manila folder inside a metal filing box under his workbench in the garage. He read them periodically, looking for the thing he had missed, the angle he hadn't pursued, the question that might have unlocked a different answer. He spoke about the case to almost no one. But every year on September 14th, he drove to the cemetery on Grand Point Highway, where Margaret Fontenot was buried, and he stood at her grave for a few minutes. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, the way you stand at a place where a debt is owed. Margaret's mother, Eloise, had died in 1991 without seeing justice. Her sister Therese had moved to Baton Rouge, then to Beaumont, then back to St. Martin Parish because she couldn't stay away from the last place her sister had been known. The reward poster that had hung in the window of Mouton's Hardware on Main Street since 1981 had bleached in the Louisiana sun to near illegibility. But the owner, out of some stubborn sense of faithfulness, had never taken it down. Dennis Mouton had retired from the rice processing plant in 1998. His children had grown, scattered, built their own lives in other parishes. His wife had died of a stroke in 2003. He was, by 2020, a 78-year-old man living alone in a brick house off Highway 31, tending a small vegetable garden and attending 9 a.m. Mass at St. Michael's when his health permitted. He had outlasted the investigation. He had outlasted the detective. He had, it appeared, outlasted justice entirely. Then, in the winter of 2021, a retired schoolteacher named Patricia Comeau, who had known Margaret Fontenot and who had never once stopped believing that the case could be solved, sent a letter to the Louisiana Attorney General's Cold Case Unit. She included Raymond Arsenault's contact information. She included the name Dennis Mouton. She had been writing that letter, in various versions, for 15 years. This time, someone wrote back. On a Tuesday morning in March 2022, Special Investigator Dana Hebert of the Louisiana Attorney General's Cold Case Unit drove to Raymond Arsenault's house in Breaux Bridge with a cardboard box of case files that had been pulled from storage, some of which Arsenault had never seen. She was 36 years old. She had worked 11 cold cases in 4 years. She sat at his kitchen table, and they read the file together. And when they reached the 1980 memo in which Arsenault had formally documented his suspicions about Dennis Mouton, she read it twice. The original wool fiber had been preserved. The St. Martin Parish evidence room was old, underfunded, and chronically disorganized. But it was also cold and dry. And the fiber that had been sealed in a paper envelope in 1980 had survived 42 years without significant degradation. Hebert sent it to the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab on March 19, 2022. DNA was extracted from the fiber. The process that followed is called investigative genetic genealogy. It works by uploading a DNA profile to public ancestry databases, the same websites where ordinary people trace their family trees, and using shared segments of genetic material to identify distant relatives, then working backward through family trees to find a single unknown individual. It is painstaking work, the genomic equivalent of finding a particular house by mapping an entire neighborhood from the air. On June 3, 2022, the DNA from Margaret Fontenot's coat collar matched a profile in the Genealogy database. The match was a second cousin, once removed. The family tree that branched from that match led, through patient reconstruction over the following 6 weeks, to a single man in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, who had been Raymond Arsenault's suspect for 42 years. Dana Hebert called Arsenault on a Wednesday afternoon. He was 83 years old. He was sitting on his back porch. "Raymond," she said, "it's Dennis Mouton." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know." Dennis Mouton was arrested on August 11, 2022, at his home on Highway 31. He was walking from his car to his front door when the deputies pulled into the driveway. He did not run. He did not speak. He looked, witnesses would later say, like a man who had been waiting for this for a long time and was, in some private and terrible way, relieved that the waiting was over. The news moved through Breaux Bridge in the way that news moves through small towns, rapidly, breathlessly, with a quality of disbelief that couldn't quite settle into anything simpler. Dennis Mouton, the man who organized the fish fry, the man who coached Little League, the man who sat 4 rows from the front at 9 a.m. Mass in the same church where he had watched Margaret Fontenot walk toward her car 42 years earlier, and had followed her. His children, scattered across Louisiana and Texas, issued a brief statement through a lawyer. They had not known, they did not believe it, and then they did, and then they had nothing left to say. At the St. Martin Parish Courthouse, the arraignment lasted 11 minutes. Dennis Mouton was charged with first-degree murder. He was held without bail. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Therese Fontenot, Margaret's sister, 71 years old, who had driven 3 hours from her home in Lafayette, sat in a plastic chair against the wall and pressed both hands flat against her knees, the way a person does when they are trying to keep something inside that wants very badly to come out. She had waited 42 years for that hallway. In the spring of 2023, Dennis Mouton pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would not explain, in open court, what had happened on the afternoon of September 14, 1980. He would not say what had drawn him to follow Margaret Fontenot out of the side door of a church where his own children sat learning about clouds. He said nothing. But the Dina said enough. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, back to where this story ends. Margaret Fontenot taught Sunday school for 11 years. She knew every child in that room by name, by family, by the way they held a crayon. She kept butterscotch candy in a jar on her desk, not as a reward, just because she thought children shouldn't have to earn sweetness. She remembered every birthday. She sent a card. She had cotton balls on the back seat of her car for a lesson about clouds she never got to teach. She had zinnias in her garden and mint on her kitchen table, and a laugh that people remembered long after the conversation was over. She had a life, entire and specific and irreplaceable, and it was taken from her on a Sunday morning in Louisiana by a man who sat in the same pew she did and let her children love her while he planned what he would do. Raymond Arsenault, 83 years old, drove to the cemetery on Grand Point Highway on September 14, 2022. He stood at Margaret's grave the way he had stood there every year for 42 years. He didn't say anything. He stayed a little longer than usual. Then, he drove home. There are thousands of cold cases across this country, with biological evidence sitting in storage: fibers, hair, fingernail scrapings, dried blood on a piece of fabric, waiting for a technology that already exists to find the family it belongs to. Margaret Fontenot's case is one of the ones that got there in time. Not every case does. What does it mean that justice, in this instance, required 42 years? A retired detective who kept a file under his workbench. A retired school teacher who kept writing letters no one answered. And a genealogy database built by people looking for their grandparents. What does it say about a community when the man who took everything from one of its most beloved members was also one of the people trusted to protect its children? And what do you believe is a life sentence, handed down 4 decades after a crime, justice? Or is it only the closest we can get? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. Justice found Margaret Fontenot after 42 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes, subscribe, and the links to more solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.